Evening Prayer, March 27th, a Friday. We're hearing from Ephesians chapter 6. And, Ephesians is one of those really excellent epistles of the New Testament that has very particular themes and a very, very tight focus from the author, St. Paul. But what we have in the beginning of chapter 6 here is what you would sometimes nickname the household code. It's a series of instructions on Christian living in various sort of ordinary vocations, in families and in work situations. And as far as what you find here, it's not particularly unique to this epistle. You find something very similar in Colossians, for example. And when you read through the beginning of chapter 6, it's also, shall we say, a tad uncomfortable for a lot of modern readers. It sounds, regressive. It sounds old-fashioned, out of date, chauvinistic, depending on whom you ask. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So at least there you get a bit of a back and forth. This is not just some sort of patriarchal call for total obedience. There is a balance. Children are called to honor, obey, respect their parents, and this is accompanied with the promise of blessing, at least in the Old Covenant law, as Paul points out. But then he turns and says, all right, fathers, parents, don't provoke your children to anger. Discipline and instruction is meant to bring people up, to make them wise, to help them grow. And if you just provoke them to anger, then you're not disciplining them in a godly way. So, it's very easy as parents to get angry with your kids when they disobey and say, nah, just go to your room. It's a very easy reaction to have. But we have to learn not to provoke our children, but to discipline them in such a way that we're actually helping them to grow, not just taking out our own anger on them. So there's a nice little back and forth there, which is important to take notice of. The following verses, 5 through 9, is where it gets a bit more dicey for how a lot of people talk about this hot button issue. Bondservants, or slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord, and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. This is very easy to misconstrue and say, oh, look at that. Paul actually endorses slavery. In a limited sense, okay, he kind of does. But what he understands as the right relationship between a slave and a master very much undermines virtually the entire concept of slavery. On one hand, the slaves or the bondservants or the employee is to obey the earthly master with fear and trembling. Okay, there's the familiar, authoritative system that we're not terribly comfortable with today. But now he takes this to a new level, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God. So he emphasizes this by saying it in a couple different ways at a couple different times. As bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. So he's making the point that you who are workers, slaves or otherwise, in whatever sense of the worker employee term goes, work, serve the earthly authority that you have, but do this as unto God himself. So your aim is to please the Lord, to please God, not to be a people pleaser, not to fulfill the whim of your master, your employer. So there is an interesting sort of undermining of the authoritative expectation. You're doing this work for me. Well, I'm working as unto the Lord, actually. Now, on the face of it, that does mean that we who labor are supposed to work hard and work earnestly and do the best job that we can. I mean, Martin Luther said something about that, right? If a shoemaker who wants to be the most godly shoemaker he or she can be is not going to achieve that by drawing little crosses on the shoes. It's like, I'm a Christian shoemaker, so I make crosses on my shoes. No, a Christian shoemaker who is trying to work as unto the Lord is going to make the darn best shoes he can possibly make, because he's working as if for Christ himself. So it's a very high work ethic, but it is for the glory of God and for the pleasure of Lord Jesus Christ. That is why he is able to finish this in verse 9 by saying, "Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." So masters, employers, authoritative persons, do the same to your employees, your servants, your slaves. Serve them as if you serve Christ. Employ them as if you employ Christ. If Jesus showed up in your workplace or in your company and asked to work, I would certainly hope you would, treat him very respectfully. Still, within the, system, I suppose. But I mean, it changes things if you're an employer, to think about your employees as if you're looking after Christ. So it's very important. And plus, there's the reality that we all serve Christ, whether we are slave or free. And that there is no partiality with God. That's one of the, that's the last line here in this particular text. So that's important to note. There is no partiality with him. We live in a world where, well, I guess we've always lived, the world has always been this way, that the rich tend to be partial to other rich people. And we're seeing that, I don't want to be overly political, but we're seeing that right now in the United States. Congress is bailing out the businesses and the stock market. Trillions of dollars, unthinkable amounts of money are being used to bail it out. And yet there's all this hand-wringing about how to bail out and assist ordinary folks who don't have a lot of money at all in the first place. There's some partiality going on here. The rich tend to look after the rich. The poor tend to look after the poor. God does not hold any partiality. There are passages in the Bible where he seems to show partiality in favoring the poor, but that's mainly because they tend to be underrepresented and generally abused in society. And so more often than not, God will happen to end up on their side against the wicked oppressors, whoever they may be. But ultimately, there is no partiality with God. He judges all, he rules all, and so we all must recognize that we are working and living as for him. This touches every part of our lives, as children, as parents, as employers, as employees. All that we do, we must do as for Jesus. And that's revolutionary, because everything has significance as a result of this. I'm not just making this video so that a few people in my church can watch it and remember that, oh yeah, I was reading the Bible and this is going to help me learn about the Bible. I mean, functionally, that's what I'm doing right here, but I'm doing this also for the glory of Christ. At least I'm trying to. So I, do the best I can with the circumstances that I have. We do that in all of our situations in life, both in family life and in work life. We labor as for the Lord. So as we come to the close of this week, I pray that you will find a new or refreshed sense of clarity as to the things that you do and how you may do them as for Jesus, or even more clearly than you already do. The Lord be with you.